Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two incredibly creepy unsolved disappearances. And both of these cases have tons of evidence to suggest that something horrifying happened. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Mary Shotwell Little had built a comfortable life for herself in Atlanta over her 3 years there. After graduating from the University of North Carolina in 1962, she left her hometown of Charlotte for the possibilities of a new life in a busier city just a few hours' drive down Interstate 85. Atlanta offered her a chance to grow professionally and personally, and she got a job as a secretary at a branch of C&S Bank. Once there, she quickly impressed her coworkers with her organizational skills and warm personality, earning a reputation as both hardworking and approachable. Supervisors also came to easily trust Mary because she maintained impeccable files, making her great to work with. Making friends was also easy for Mary, and she developed a tight-knit group of coworkers and roommates who often spent time together outside the office. By September 1965, Mary was newly married to an insurance auditor named Roy Little Jr., and the couple settled into a modest home in Decatur just outside the city. And while the happy newlyweds were still in the honeymoon phase of the relationship and Mary was independent and driven, she also had a deep appreciation for family values and often talked about how excited she was to start a family one day. She also relished the opportunity to set up their new home and took pride in decorating it so it could be shown off when the couple hosted small gatherings with friends. And likewise, known for her similarly polished appearance, Mary stood 5'6" and weighed 120 pounds with hazel green eyes and light brown hair she kept styled in soft curls. Despite her outward confidence though, Mary had a softer, more introspective side that few people saw. She was sentimental and kept handwritten letters from friends and family tucked away in her purse. She was also a hopeless romantic and was a sucker for flowers and sentimental gifts. And Roy made sure to appeal to that side of her with frequent surprises for no other occasion than just because. If she had a chance to write her story herself, Mary probably wouldn't have changed a thing, but it all came to an abrupt halt on October 14th, 1965. The day began just like any other, but she had made plans in the evening to meet up with a coworker for dinner and shopping. When the bank closed for the day, Mary hopped in her car and made a quick stop at the Colonial grocery store to buy groceries for a dinner party she was hosting the next evening. Once she had everything she needed, Mary drove over to Lenox Square, which is a popular Atlanta shopping center, where Isla Stack was waiting for her. The pair then chatted over dinner at the S&S cafeteria, sharing stories about Mary's recent marriage and her proposed dinner party menu for the next night. Mary also mentioned how happy she was in her new marriage, but she also hinted that she was concerned over some recent developments at work without going into too much detail. When they were finished, Mary and Isla browsed the aisles at Rich's department store, laughing as they sifted through racks of clothing and home goods. Finally, as it got to be about 8 o'clock that night, the two decided to go their separate ways and did so with a hug and promises to see one another at work the next morning. When Isla arrived at C&S Bank on October 15th, however, Mary's desk sat completely empty. At first, no one was overly concerned. They figured maybe she was running late or had a sudden errand to take care of. As the hours passed by, however, the worry deepened. Mary had never been late before, and with her absence extending to lunchtime, calls were made to her home and eventually to the police. Roy was also out of town on business, but Mary's coworkers were able to get in touch with him, hoping that he might have some insight into where his wife was. But he hadn't heard from her either, and worse yet, he said that it didn't seem like she came home after the meeting with Isla at Lenox Square. This meant it was finally time to admit what no one wanted to acknowledge: something was terribly wrong. As attempts to reach Mary came up empty, police first scoured the parking lot at Lenox Square and actually found her car in section Yellow 32. It was her gray Mercury Comet, but something was immediately off about it. The vehicle was covered in red dust as if it had just been driven down a dirt road. Now, the state of Georgia even today has plenty of red clay dirt roads, but the area of Atlanta where Mary was known to be was almost certainly paved long ago. Even more strangely, inside the car, police also found groceries still in the backseat, but most alarming were the specks of blood that dotted the seats, the driver's side door handle, and the passenger side window. Grass clippings also clung to the dried blood stains on the vinyl where a passenger's head might have rested, and maybe most strangely, Mary's undergarments were carefully rolled and tucked between the seats. And when they were retrieved and examined more closely, police found spots of blood in those too. A black brassiere was also found in the floorboards, and a section of stocking was found neatly cut as if by a knife or scissors. There was also something about the blood that seemed different from other crime scenes police were used to. The amount wasn't any more than someone might get from a nosebleed, and there was something about it that felt staged. The placement of her personal items just didn't seem organic. They almost seemed like a deliberate attempt to confuse investigators, making it unclear whether Mary was harmed in the car, somewhere else entirely, or even at all. So next, blood samples were analyzed, revealing the likely presence of Mary's blood, but the small quantity still puzzled experts. The unusual red dust found on the car's exterior was also studied, and soil experts suggested that it could have come from a construction site or a rural dirt road, pointing to the possibility that the car had been moved after Mary and Isla left the night before. Detectives then retraced Mary's movements by interviewing store clerks and Lenox Square security officers and constructed her timeline using receipts and witness statements. It was found that the mall security officers conducted several routine patrols earlier that morning, which included Section Yellow 32, but none of them recalled seeing the Gray Mercury comet, yet by noon, there it was. An examination of the odometer then revealed approximately 41 miles that were unaccounted for. Investigators could only speculate that the car may have been driven out of town and returned to the lot on the morning of October 15th. Fingerprints collected from the vehicle were then run through databases, but this yielded no matches either. Authorities then turned to forensic psychologists who speculated the perpetrator might have known Mary, as the crime seemed methodical and personal rather than impulsive. As all of this was going on, within 24 hours of her disappearance, Mary's credit card was actually used at gas stations in Charlotte and Raleigh, leaving investigators scrambling to catch up with whatever was going on. The receipts from these transactions also had what appeared to be Mary's authentic signature, which she signed Mrs. Roy H. Little Jr. The gas station attendants were then interviewed, and they gave chilling accounts as they recalled a frightened woman with light brown hair and blood on her clothing sitting rigidly in the passenger seat of a gray car, looking disoriented and refusing to make eye contact. They also described two men who were rough-looking and intense, and they were on either side of her, causing the attendants to grow suspicious. Rumors then surfaced that the men had ties to organized crime, and authorities briefly explored whether Mary had been taken as part of a trafficking ring. But despite the eyewitness accounts, the leads failed to answer questions. It sort of left detectives wondering whether Mary had been coerced into traveling across state lines, or if she was already injured or something and unable to escape. As investigators continued to dig into the lead up to Mary's disappearance, things began to emerge that made the case even more puzzling. Weeks ahead of October 14th, Mary's behavior noticeably shifted at work. Coworkers had noticed that she didn't have her usual cheerful demeanor, and she seemed distracted, often glancing nervously at the entrance to the bank, almost as if she was expecting someone to show up. Her phone calls also became brief and tense, and more than once, colleagues noticed Mary lower her voice mid-conversation while on the phone. There was also an incident with roses. There were 5 in total, and they were delivered to her desk with no card. At first, Mary smiled and brushed it off as a harmless gesture, even joking that Roy must have been stepping up his romantic game. But her smile quickly faded when she learned that her husband hadn't sent them. She then confided in a coworker that the flowers from the unknown sender made her uneasy and that she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. And the roses weren't the only sign that something was wrong. Mary began asking coworkers to walk her to her car in the evenings, and she took extra care to keep her doors locked both at work and at home. Her friends didn't press her for details, but in hindsight, they wished they all had. Mary also became nervous and weary of being alone, even during the day, and told coworkers about strange phone calls she'd receive at the office. She was also overheard saying things like, "I'm a married woman now, and you can come over to my house anytime you like, but I can't come over there." This paranoia left friends uneasy, and now it seemed completely justified. Mary's disappearance would ultimately spark one of Atlanta's largest missing person searches. Thousands of volunteers combed the area as pilots scanned the skies, and military reservists scoured the wooded areas around Lenox Square. Apparently, even jail inmates were brought in to search for any sign of her, and rewards climbed to $3,000, but no credible leads emerged. Police headquarters overflowed with clothing and personal items that were found by volunteers, hoping for a match, but nothing ever led back to Mary. Investigators followed every lead they got from coworkers, friends, and strangers who might have crossed her path, but despite their efforts, the trail went cold. 18 months later, however, things took an even darker turn. After it was clear that Mary wasn't going to be returning, her position and desk at C&S Bank were assigned to a coworker named Diane Shields. Diane was 22 years old, bright and ambitious, and although she had grown up in neighboring Alabama, she moved to Atlanta to build her career, similar to Mary. And also similar to Mary, Diane had a natural charm that made her popular both in and outside the office. Diane's connection to Mary, however, ran deeper than their shared desk at C&S Bank. For a time, Diane lived with Mary's former roommates, making bonds that seemed to echo Mary's social circle, but soon enough, Diane's life began to mirror Mary's in more unsettling ways. She, too, began receiving roses at work that she tried to laugh off, but privately, Diane admitted they made her uncomfortable. Friends then noted that Diane started becoming more secretive and that she'd disappear for hours without explanation. She then also confided to one close friend that she'd been working with police hoping to uncover answers about Mary's disappearance. This growing unease hinted at fears that she never shared with anyone and culminated on May 19, 1967, when she left work in her blue and white Chevy Impala and never made it home. Her body was later found stuffed in the trunk of her car, fully clothed with a scarf and a piece of paper shoved into her mouth. There was no indication that she had been assaulted or robbed, leaving her death just as perplexing as Mary's disappearance. And while both cases obviously share eerie similarities, authorities were divided over whether the two crimes were connected. The FBI outright dismissed any link between the cases, labeling the similarities as coincidental. Meanwhile, many local investigators disagreed, believing Diane may have stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to know. But her murder, like Mary's disappearance, remains unsolved, which has only deepened the mystery surrounding both cases. Over the years since the instance, rumors have swirled about love affairs, blackmail, and revenge. One theory says that Mary had been abducted by someone she knew, possibly a spurned admirer or a former flame unwilling to let go. Another line of inquiry focused on the possibility that Mary may have witnessed something she shouldn't have involving organized crime, and so she was made to disappear. Another interesting piece of information came forward in 1966, before Diane was actually murdered. That year, a Reidsville State Prison inmate named Larry Stargell came forward and claimed to know what happened to Mary. According to Larry, a man named Jerry Mason was hired to kidnap her. Jerry supposedly even showed Larry her C&S Bank credit card and bragged about burying Mary near Atlanta's municipal airport. Construction workers later even reported finding a suspicious, freshly dug hole near a runway, but authorities never excavated it. Larry would eventually even provide a detailed 19-page statement, but then refused to sign it, leaving his confession and the validity of it in limbo. So, in the end, Mary's disappearance remains one of Atlanta's most haunting mysteries. With no body, no definitive answers, and only speculation to connect her to Diane, the story is as unsettled today as it was in the 1960s. The fall air was crisp as October 24, 1961 was getting underway in Lincoln, Massachusetts. It was shaping up to be a productive day, which was a good thing for 31-year-old Joanne Risch. Her schedule that day was packed, and it began with seeing her husband Martin off for a business trip that would take him to New York City. He was scheduled to stay overnight, leaving Joanne to manage the household alone, which was something she did often because of his work. Once he was on his way to Boston's airport, she turned her attention to the couple's two children, 4-year-old Lillian and 2-year-old David. Breakfast was already prepared though, and clothes were laid out before she woke each of them up to get their routines underway. They'd have to eat quickly because Lillian had a dentist appointment Joanne had to get her to, and before that, David would need to be dropped off across the street into the care of their neighbor Barbara. A couple of hours later, Joanne's to-do list had gotten shorter. Children and the dentist don't always mix so well, but Lillian had been so good during her appointment that Joanne stopped at a department store on their way back to treat the 4-year-old to a little reward. Then around 11:15 a.m., Joanne picked David up and the family arrived back home just in time to start making lunch. Once the children had eaten again, David was put down for his afternoon nap while Joanne welcomed Barbara and her son over to play with Lillian. There was no time for Joanne to sit and visit though. The bushes out front weren't going to prune themselves, so after changing into a more casual house dress and sneakers, Joanne left Barbara to watch the children before heading out to tend to the shrubs. After she finished, it was getting close to 2 o'clock, so she returned the shears to the garage and then went inside to get David up from his nap. She needed to run out again to complete the next task on her list, but instead of bringing the kids along, she once again asked Barbara if she'd mind watching them at her house. Barbara agreed, and then the whole group made their way across the street to her home before Joanne turned to leave, promising to be back shortly. Joanne's life in Lincoln seemed like it was really settling into something great. She and Martin moved into the neighborhood just 6 months earlier, and with a husband climbing the corporate ladder, 2 healthy children, and a home in a quiet historic neighborhood, she was living a life that was fairly typical of suburban family life in the early 1960s. And this was great because things weren't always so idyllic for her. When Joanne was 8 years old, her life took a tragic turn when her parents died in a suspicious fire at their New Jersey home. Joanne, who had been visiting relatives in Brooklyn at the time, returned home to find her world forever changed. She was then forced to move in with her maternal aunt and uncle who formally adopted her. Despite the tragedy though, Joanne would make the most out of her life. She graduated from college in 1952 with a degree in English literature before launching a promising career in publishing. Then, starting as a secretary, she climbed the ranks to become an editorial assistant at a prestigious publishing house. It was during this time that she met Martin, who was a Harvard Business School graduate and U.S. Air Force veteran. The couple married in 1956, moved to Connecticut, and soon welcomed Lillian into the world. 2 years after that, David was born, and a little more than a year after that, they settled in Lincoln. All in all, Joanne was living a life that she dreamed of, which only made what happened next all the more troubling. The promise Joanne made that afternoon to pick the children up after running a quick errand was the first sign that something was wrong. As the afternoon wore past 3:30 without any sign of her, Barbara became certain that Joanne had to have returned, so she walked Lily and David back home. The house was unlocked, so Barbara ushered the two little ones inside and left without making any further contact with Joanne. She just figured she was busy, so Barbara didn't want to disturb her. Another 30 minutes would pass before Barbara heard a soft tapping coming from her back door. When she approached to answer, she could see through the screen that it was Lillian all by herself and in tears. Barbara then opened the door and asked the little girl what was wrong, and through her cries, Lillian said something that chilled Barbara right to the bone, saying, "Mommy is gone and the kitchen is covered in red paint." Barbara needed a moment to process what Lillian was saying, and she could have easily chalked it up to the vivid imagination of a child, but she picked Lillian up and hurried across the street. When she entered the home, Barbara could have never prepared herself for what she saw. The kitchen floor was smeared with blood with thick streaks dragged across the tiles. A telephone had also been ripped from the wall and its cord was sitting there dangling and frayed. The handset was also discarded in a garbage that sat oddly out of place in the center of the room. A bloody thumbprint also marked the wall, and a trail of blood droplets led out the kitchen door, ending abruptly in the garage near the family car. Joanne, however, was nowhere to be found. Barbara's frantic call to the police afterwards set off an investigation that would immediately puzzle detectives. Within moments, a police sergeant arrived at the house, and his initial assessment of the scene was a grim one. He actually searched the property, half expecting to find Joanne's body somewhere nearby, but when he didn't, he radioed for backup. As reinforcements arrived, smears in the kitchen began to suggest that someone had staggered around, possibly injured, yet the amount of blood at the scene, which was roughly half a pint, was far less than what might be expected from a fatal injury. There were also no bloody footprints anywhere, as if the person bleeding had floated above the floor. In addition to the blood discovered in the kitchen and outside in the garage and on the driveway, there were droplets found on the staircase, inside the master bedroom, and near a window in the children's bedroom. Several items, including a coverall belonging to David, were also found on the floor covered in blood, as if someone had attempted to clean up the various spills and streaks. 3 bloody fingerprints had also been found at the scene, but since Joanne had never been fingerprinted, police couldn't determine if they belonged to her or not. And when they were run against the FBI database, nothing came back as a match. Then, in testing the blood at the scene, it was determined to be type O, which Joanne was known to have, but it also just so happens to be the most common type. And beyond the blood, there was other interesting physical evidence left behind too. Joanne's trench coat, which she wore to Lillian's dentist appointment that morning, was still in the house, as was her purse containing cash. On the kitchen counter, a telephone directory also sat open to the page where emergency contacts would be recorded, but there were no numbers written down. In police interviews with neighbors and potential witnesses afterwards, strange details were also reported that only added to the confusion. Virginia Keene, the daughter of the family's next-door neighbors, recalled seeing a dirty, 2-tone blue car parked in Joanne's driveway earlier that afternoon. She described it as an older model, possibly a General Motors vehicle, although she couldn't provide more specifics. Another neighbor said they stopped their own car to let a vehicle back out of the driveway belonging to either the family or the neighbor, but didn't get a good look at the driver or the make of the car. Someone else who lived in the neighborhood said they saw a blue car that matched the one Virginia described parked nearby around 2:45 that afternoon. Outside the car, the witness spotted a man cutting branches and placing them in his trunk before driving off. Then on top of that, the family's regular milkman also recalled seeing a similar vehicle parked at the house 5 days before Joanne disappeared. The complexity of the scene and these statements from neighbors were more than enough to keep the police busy, but as word got out about the missing woman, more witnesses came forward and muddied the waters even further. Several witnesses said they saw a disoriented woman matching Joanne's description walking along nearby roads that afternoon. Around 2:45 p.m., a woman wearing similar clothing to what Joanne was known to be wearing with a kerchief tied around her head was spotted walking along Massachusetts Route 2A, hunched over as if she were cold. Shortly after that, between 3:15 and 3:30, another sighting was reported on Route 128 in neighboring Waltham. This time, the woman was described as having blood running down her legs and cradling something at her stomach, moving erratically as if in distress. Then by 4:30, yet another sighting was reported of a woman resembling Joanne walking along Route 128 near Chapella Road, and apparently also appearing dazed and disoriented. Despite these reports, however, none were ever confirmed, and the descriptions varied just enough to cast doubt on whether any of the sightings were actually Joanne. At this point, police weren't even sure what kind of case they were investigating, and unfortunately, that would never become clear. The answer to what happened to Joanne that fall afternoon in 1961 has never come, leaving behind only speculation and uncertainty. Between the evidence, witness statements, and media written about the case over the years, it's believed that one of 4 possible things occurred. Joanne was murdered, Joanne was taken, Joanne had an accident, or Joanne staged the scene and ran away. And it's important to note that none of these have been ruled out, but there are some possibilities that are better supported by the evidence than others. Let's start with the possibility that Joanne was murdered in the home. When conducting a murder investigation, police generally begin by looking at the people closest to the victim. In this case, the closest person to Joanne was Martin, but his alibi was rock solid. It was confirmed that he flew from Boston to New York and was in Manhattan when Joanne was last seen in Lincoln, so almost immediately police had to rule out their most likely suspect. And since the family was also relatively new to Lincoln, Martin and Joanne had little time to develop any enemies. On top of that, the determination that only about half a pint of blood was spilled in the house indicated that whatever wound might have been suffered by Joanne was not life-threatening. This, however, doesn't discount the possibility of her being taken and killed somewhere else. In the early goings of the investigation, police thought it was possible that Joanne had been observed by an abductor in the days leading up to her disappearance. According to one of the neighbors, the night before Joanne vanished, the sound of the neighbor's garage door opening and closing was heard around sunset. When the neighbor went to investigate, they found nothing was out of place. Then on the day Joanne disappeared, the neighbor heard the garage door open and close again around 3 o'clock that afternoon, which is right around the time she would have been attacked and abducted. With this information and what was found at the scene, police would put together the following theory. After dropping Lillian and David off at Barbara's house, Joanne hurried back home to begin the errand she intended to run, but she was attacked in the driveway. The perpetrator is thought to have surprised her by springing into the neighbor's garage and hiding behind Joanne's car. When she approached, he jumped out and struck her across the face, thus causing her to begin bleeding. She then fell across the car trunk and slid down the right rear fender, which would explain the bloodstains found there. After gathering herself, Joanne ran into the kitchen through the back door and attempted to call police. Blood found in the fingerholes of the rotary dial on the phone indicated she was in the middle of placing the call when she was interrupted by the assailant, who pulled the cord from the wall and struck Joanne once again. Then, likely incapacitated by the blow, Joanne was carried to a car outside and driven away. The FBI, however, had a different take on things. To their investigators, the evidence and witness statements seemed to point to some kind of accident occurring in the house. Although police all but dismissed the numerous claims of a woman matching Joanne's description wandering aimlessly down the highways, the FBI wasn't so quick to toss this theory aside. Instead, they believed that Joanne may have injured herself in some way in the kitchen. Whatever injury she sustained, it was enough to cause her to panic and lose enough blood to put her into a state of shock. In this hazy state, she may have wandered out of the house in search of help, but the loss of blood caused her to stagger and sway along the route. Another investigator looking into the case in the 1990s sided with the FBI's opinion, even went as far as to suggest that Joanne fell off the roadway into a construction zone along Route 128. Then, between the loss of blood and the fall, Joanne was unable to pull herself out of the roadside pit and she ended up buried beneath the road, according to this expanded theory. But the last possibility might be the most intriguing of them all. While several people close to Joanne have claimed over the years that there was no way she'd run away from her family, proponents of the theory point to some interesting library records that were uncovered following Joanne's disappearance. Since Joanne was a frequent visitor to a local library, a group of volunteers traced back the book record checkouts from 1961 and found that she had borrowed 25 books that summer. And what was most interesting about this was the subject matter of many of her selections. Most of the books were about murder and missing persons cases. A Lincoln journalist looking into the case found that Joanne had checked out a book about the alleged mysterious disappearance of one of Brigham Young's many wives, and another called Into Thin Air about a woman who went missing and left behind blood smears as evidence. Now, obviously, it could be argued that this is all coincidental, but the runaway theory actually has not one, but two witnesses who claim to back it up. On the evening Joanne disappeared, a taxi driver in Boston recalled a fare matching Joanne's description. The woman stuck out to him because she seemed confused, as if she didn't know where she wanted to go, but eventually the driver ended up dropping her off at the bus terminal. After he came forward and the days after word of Joanne's disappearance got out, police showed him a photo lineup which included Joanne's picture, and immediately he pointed to Joanne's image and said that it was without a doubt the woman he picked up and took to the bus terminal. Then beyond this, and further investigating this lead, police spoke with a ticket clerk who claimed to have sold a bus ticket to a confused and disheveled woman. And similarly, when the clerk was shown the same photo lineup, she also pointed to the image of Joanne. However, whether or not this woman was Joanne, police failed to track her down and she was never seen again. So, what exactly happened to Joanne on that October day in 1961 is anyone's guess. All of the original investigators in the case have passed away, as well as Martin, who died in 2009, believing Joanne was still out there somewhere, alive and well. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Also, in case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.